The first time I realized a 5-inch strip of wood could threaten a whole home, the sun was sliding down behind the roofs at the end of our cul-de-sac and the sprinklers were hissing in the distance. I stood in my backyard, looking at my brand new privacy fence, and imagined a line I could not see but definitely felt, 6 feet from the grass to the top rail. 5 inches past that invisible ceiling, according to the association, and everything I had worked for could suddenly be put at risk. It sounds absurd to say a family might lose the place they live over a measurement you could cover with your hand. But that is how power works when it is petty and unchecked. It does not need to be reasonable. It just needs a rule, a ruler, and someone who enjoys using both. As the evening air cooled and the smell of cut grass hung over the cul-de-sac, I felt the smallest knot of dread form under my ribs. I did not know yet that the neighbor 2 houses down, the one who watched everyone through her front window, had already decided my fence was her next project. I did not know she had called the management company twice that week, or that my address had already landed on the association's agenda. I only knew that the fence finally gave my family some privacy, and for the first time since we moved in, I could sit on the back patio without feeling like the whole street could see every move we made. What I also did not know was that the same privacy was about to trigger a chain reaction of letters, threats, and deadlines. The board would claim authority over 5 inches of space, and they would use that sliver as a lever to pry open every weak spot they could find. I would spend late nights studying our governing documents like exam notes, tracing every line in CCR Section 7.4, the section on fences and screening, with a pen and a growing sense of defiance. By the time I understood how far they were willing to push, it was too late to stay small and compliant. The only real choice left was whether I let them turn that 5-inch violation into a weapon or whether I learned to bend the rule back around them. This feud started with a fence, but it ended as something else entirely, a kind of quiet, calculated justice. And the most satisfying part is that their own rules handed me the tools to do it. When my wife and I first drove into the cul-de-sac, it seemed like the kind of street that never made the news. The maple trees on the corner houses leaned over the road just enough to cast dappled shade, and on weekends you could hear kids' bikes rattling over the pavement and the soft thud of basketballs. The place had that well-maintained, slightly curated feel that usually means one thing: a homeowners association. We knew that going in. The listing mentioned community guidelines, and the welcome packet we got after closing showed up as a fat white binder, the board's version of scripture. Inside were the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all laid out in dense paragraphs with section numbers and subsections that looked like they had been photocopied 100 times. CCR Section 7.4 was the one that drew my eye right away. It was the section titled Fences and Screening. According to Section 7.4, fences in our phase of the neighborhood could not exceed 6 feet in height as measured from the finished grade on the highest side of the fence. They had to be constructed in approved materials and colors, no staggering, no uneven top lines, nothing visually disruptive. Any changes required an architectural change request, submitted on a specific form and approved in writing before construction. The words were cold on the page, but even then I understood that this was more than guidance. It was power codified. Most of the properties on our cul-de-sac had fences that looked almost identical: weathered wood, flat tops, 6 feet high, facing boards aligned like soldiers. The house we bought was different. The previous owner had never put in a proper fence, just a patchwork of short panels and an open side that looked out toward the neighbor's raised deck. Standing in the yard, I could see straight into their sliding door and right across to their kitchen. At night their lights spilled into our space like we were sharing a living room. That neighbor, the one with the deck, was a woman I will call Cheryl. She was the kind of person who could make watering her flowers feel like reconnaissance. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel her eyes skim over our yard, pausing on anything that had changed. When our trash can sat out a little too long one morning, she appeared in her driveway with her arms folded. When my kids left chalk drawings on the sidewalk, she stared at them from her porch until they drifted back inside. It did not take long for the pattern to show. The cul-de-sac had its rhythms, its shared routines, but there was also a current of control running just under the surface. The board president, a quiet man I will call Mr. K, liked to walk the loop with a clipboard in hand. The treasurer carried a file folder to every block gathering and took notes when people mentioned anything that sounded like a complaint. And Cheryl, who had lived there for years, was their unofficial scout. At first I tried to play the game the way they clearly expected. I read the binder, I filled out the architectural change request form for the fence, and I made sure to attach photos and a sketch. That form, stamped received April 5th, and slid back under my front door by the property manager, would become the first evidence prop in this whole mess. Back then, though, it was just a piece of paper that made me feel like I was doing things the right way. I imagined the fence as a simple improvement. We would match the approved design, keep it 6 feet high, and finally reclaim the backyard as a private space instead of a stage. The management company emailed me a one-line approval referencing CCR Section 7.4, and I took that as a sign that we were good. Standing in the soft afternoon light, listening to a mower hum somewhere beyond the cul de sac, I felt like we had cleared the one major hurdle. I had no idea that the real problem would come from the smallest detail, and from the neighbor who never missed a detail. The contractor came out on a Tuesday morning, his truck rattling slightly as it pulled to the curb. The sky was a flat, hazy blue, and the air had that cool bite that promised it would be hot by noon. He walked the property line with me, tape measure in hand, checking the slope and marking the post locations with bright orange paint. We talked about the 6-foot limit, and he assured me he had done plenty of work in association-controlled neighborhoods. He knew the drill. Our backyard sloped gently down from the house toward the side where Cheryl's property sat slightly higher. From inside our yard, the fence would be an even 6 feet tall, measured from our grass. From the street, though, on one short stretch along the side, the ground rose just enough on her side that the exact same panels looked taller. It was the kind of subtle difference you do not see unless you go looking for it, unless you stand on the sidewalk with a tape measure and a certain kind of satisfaction in your heart. By the end of the day, the frame was up and the boards were going in, one by one. The sound of the nail gun echoed softly between the houses. My kids watched from the back steps while my wife brought out iced tea. For the first time, when I turned my head toward Cheryl's deck, I could not see the inside of her home anymore. Instead I saw warm-colored wood and the suggestion of space that belonged to us and only us. That evening, as the contractor packed up, I noticed Cheryl standing on the sidewalk with a small notebook in her hand. She walked the length of the new fence slowly, then disappeared back inside without even glancing in our direction. I told myself not to read into it. People are curious when something new goes up. But in the fading light I saw the glint of a metal tape measure at the edge of her pocket, and a chill slid through the warm air brushing my arms. 2 days later, an envelope appeared in our mailbox with the association's logo in the corner. Inside, on crisp white paper, was a courtesy notice dated May 29th. The subject line read, "Fence height violation, Lot 14." It referenced CCR Section 7.4 and stated that a section of our fence appeared to exceed the 6-foot maximum as measured from the highest adjacent grade. It gave us 30 days to correct the violation or face potential fines and further enforcement. The language was calm, but the implication was not. I reread the notice at the kitchen table while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The phrase that stuck with me was, "as measured from the highest adjacent grade." It felt slippery, like something that could be spun whichever way suited the board at any given moment. I took the notice out to the yard and held it in my hand as I walked the fence line, feeling the roughness of the boards under my fingertips. From our side, everything looked exactly as planned. Later that week, I saw Cheryl again, walking her small dog along the sidewalk. She stopped near the suspect section, glanced back at our house, and wrote something in her notebook. It was not subtle. In that moment I understood that this was not a neutral enforcement of a rule. This was personal. My fence did not block the street view or ruin the look of the cul de sac. It blocked her view. That made it unacceptable. I spent that night with the binder open on the dining table, pages fanned out under the overhead light like evidence in a case. I compared the association's language to the city's zoning code I found online. The city allowed fences up to 6.5 feet in residential backyards. Our association had chosen a stricter standard, one they could use to exert more control. As I traced the lines with my finger, I realized how perfect this setup was for someone who enjoyed filing complaints. It was the start of a real Karen neighbor drama, only now I was living inside it instead of watching it from a safe distance. I called the management company the next morning and asked them how they were measuring. The representative told me, in a careful tone, that a board member and the property manager had used a tape measure from the sidewalk on Cheryl's side. They believed the fence exceeded 6 feet in one section by approximately 5 inches. There was no acknowledgement that our side of the yard sloped differently, no mention of the architectural approval already granted. The courtesy notice, they insisted, was just a first step. That phrase haunted me more than the word violation. A first step to what? Fines? Liens against the property? The binder mentioned that unpaid fines could, in extreme cases, result in legal action and even foreclosure. I had always assumed those were just scare tactics reserved for serious misconduct. Now they were floating at the edges of my mind over a 5-inch discrepancy created by a sloping yard. The way the system was designed, the board did not need to be reasonable. They just needed to follow their own process, step by step. As the days passed, I noticed changes in how some neighbors looked at us. There was a subtle shift when they drove by or slowed down during evening walks. The word violation carried a quiet weight in a community built on the appearance of order. I could almost feel the association's eyes on our house, counting down the days on that courtesy clock. The 30 days they had given us were not just a timeline to adjust a fence. They were the beginning of something much bigger, a test of how far their authority could reach into a homeowner's life. That was the moment I realized the countdown on that courtesy notice was not just about a fence, it was a deadline for my family's peace. If I misstepped, that harmless-looking letter could start a chain of enforcement that dragged us all the way from a 5-inch mistake to a real threat against our home. And if the board was willing to swing that kind of power over inches of wood, I knew this fight would not end with a simple trim. The countdown on that courtesy notice ticked away at the back of my mind like a quiet kitchen timer I could not shut off. Every time I walked past the refrigerator where I had magnet clipped it, my eyes went straight to the bold 30-day window. It was remarkable how a line about corrective action could sit on the same surface as my kids' drawings and our grocery list and still manage to dominate the whole door. I tried to tell myself that this was just a misunderstanding, a technicality that would resolve once I explained the slope and the measurements. I sent an email to the property manager with photos from both sides of the fence, measurements taken from the inside of our yard, and a copy of my original architectural change request stamped received April 5th. I laid it all out as calmly as I could, highlighting that the fence was exactly 6 feet on our side and that the variance on the far side was caused by natural grade changes. The response came back in a short paragraph that could have been a template. The manager thanked me for the clarification, acknowledged my photos, and repeated that the board maintains that the fence exceeds the allowable height as measured from the highest adjacent grade. They mentioned that the courtesy notice was a chance to avoid fines and further enforcement, and reminded me of the deadline. I stared at the screen, feeling the words, "the board maintains," sink in. It did not matter that they now had evidence showing the other side of the story. They had already settled on their version of reality, and my job, in their eyes, was to conform. Out in the Cul de Sac that evening, as the streetlights flicked on and the sky turned deep blue, I watched Cheryl walk her dog again, pausing where the sidewalk ran along the high side of our yard. She did not look at me directly, but I could feel her satisfaction from 20 yards away. By the time we reached the halfway point of the 30 days, the fence no longer felt like a simple home improvement. It felt like a deadline looming over everything else. I woke up earlier than usual and found myself reading the governing documents over coffee, tracking cross-references between sections like someone studying a foreign language. I learned that CCR Section 11.2 covered fines and enforcement remedies, and that it allowed the association to impose daily or weekly fines for unremedied violations after proper notice and an opportunity to be heard. Those last 4 words, opportunity to be heard, stuck with me. Buried in the dense paragraphs, they were the closest thing to a safeguard I could find. If the board wanted to escalate past a courtesy notice, they needed to give us formal notice of a hearing date and a chance to respond. It sounded fair in theory. But the more I read, the more I understood how easily the balance could tilt. The board decided what counted as a violation, chose the date of the hearing, and voted on the outcome. They were the ones writing the script and grading the performance. We reached the 25th day with no second letter yet, but the tension made every walk to the mailbox a small adrenaline hit. I found myself scanning the street more often, noticing little things I had never paid attention to before: a neighboring house with a shed that looked slightly taller than allowed, another yard with a non-standard mailbox, a third with a string of permanent lights that technically violated the "No Year-Round Decorative Lighting" clause buried in CCR Section 8.3. The rules were not applied evenly. They were applied where someone decided to make an issue. That was what bothered me most. This was not about keeping uniform standards. It was about selective enforcement dressed up as fairness. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the leaves of the maple trees and the sound of distant traffic faded, I felt a stubbornness start to form in me. I had followed the process. I had gotten approval. I had built the fence to the measurements we agreed on. The slope could not be my fault, and yet I was the one with a target on my house. 5 days before the deadline, the second envelope came. This one was heavier, with more pages inside. It was titled Notice of Violation and Hearing and referenced both CCR Section 7.4 and Section 11.2. According to the letter, the board had determined that a portion of my fence exceeded 6 feet in height by approximately 5 inches and remained out of compliance. They had scheduled a hearing for June 28 at 7 p.m. in the community room at the front of the subdivision. The letter listed possible outcomes: formal violation on record, fines of up to $50 per day until corrected, and potential legal fees if the matter progressed. It also included what would become my second major evidence prop, a board agenda excerpt attached to the notice, with one line that read, in stark black text, "New business, Lot 14, fence enforcement action." Seeing my home reduced to a bullet point under "New business" made my stomach twist. I held the notice under the kitchen light, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning through the vent. On the surface, it was just an enforcement step, one of many in their process. But between the lines, I could see the escalation path laid out like stepping stones: notice, hearing, fines, liens, and, if someone really wanted to push it, foreclosure. It was a full-blown HOA nightmare queued up over 5 inches of wood. The day after receiving the notice, I saw Cheryl and the treasurer standing together at the corner of the Cul de Sac near the stop sign. The treasurer held the same kind of folder I had seen him carry before, the one he brought to board meetings. As I pulled into the drive, they both looked in my direction. Their expressions were neutral, but the timing was not lost on me. Gossip travels fast in a tight little circle of houses like ours, and the rumor that Lot 14 was under enforcement would only give them more fuel. I realized then that this was not only a matter of measurements and bylaws. It was becoming a story about who was in line and who was not. The association wielded its rules the way a picky parent wields disapproval, and now we were the ones being held up as an example. It bothered me not just for myself, but for my kids. I did not want them to grow up thinking that community meant constant surveillance and quiet punishment. As the hearing date approached, I prepared as if I were going into an exam. I printed the architectural change request with the "Received, April 5th" stamp. I highlighted the section of the city zoning code that allowed slightly taller fences. I took photos of other minor violations around the neighborhood and organized them into a folder, not to throw anyone under the bus, but to show that enforcement was anything but consistent. If they wanted a process, I was going to meet them with documentation of my own. The evening of the hearing was heavy and still, the air thick with the smell of warm asphalt and cut grass. The community room sat at the entrance to the subdivision, a low brick building with fluorescent lights that always made everyone look a little washed out. When I walked in, 3 folding tables had been set up at the front, forming a makeshift dais. The board members sat behind them with stacks of papers, pens, and plastic cups of water. Mr. K, the president, sat in the center with his clipboard. The treasurer took notes to his right. The property manager sat slightly off to the side with a laptop open. I took a seat in the row of metal chairs facing them, my folder of evidence on my lap. A small wall clock ticked quietly above the doorway. In the corner, an oscillating fan pushed warm air in slow arcs. They opened with routine business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing a landscaping contract, noting a minor budget adjustment for playground maintenance. I listened with half an ear, the sound of their voices blending with the low whir of the fan. Then they reached "New business, Lot 14, fence enforcement action," and I felt the room tighten around me. They laid out their position in simple terms. According to their measurement on the highest adjacent side, a portion of my fence exceeded the 6-foot limit by approximately 5 inches. They referenced the language from CCR Section 7.4 and emphasized their duty to maintain consistent standards. I was then given a chance to respond. I explained the slope. I pointed out that from our yard, the fence was exactly 6 feet tall. I handed over the architectural change request approval, treating it like the official permission slip it was. I mentioned the city's more generous height allowance, not as a challenge, but as context. I tried to be calm and factual, focusing on the idea that any overage was minimal and unintentional, the product of grades and tape measures, not defiance. As I spoke, Cheryl sat in the second row, slightly off to the side, arms folded. She had come to the meeting without being required, which told me more than anything else how invested she was in the outcome. When I showed photos of other minor deviations around the neighborhood, I saw a flicker of irritation cross the treasurer's face, as if I were breaking some unwritten rule by pointing out the inconsistency. The board deliberated for only a few minutes, speaking quietly among themselves while I sat listening to the fan click at the end of each sweep. They did not retreat to another room. They did not need to. This was a small theater, and they were comfortable with their roles. When they turned back to me, their conclusion came in the same smooth, composed tone they used to discuss landscaping. They acknowledged my explanation but upheld the finding of a violation. They said the overage was measurable and therefore actionable under CCR Section 7.4. They agreed to limit the fine to $25 per day, effective 10 days after the date of the hearing if the fence remained out of compliance. They also noted that continued non-compliance could lead to additional enforcement, including legal action. It was framed as a compromise, but it felt like a warning disguised as kindness. I walked out into the warm night lightheaded, my folder of carefully prepared evidence suddenly heavier in my hand. Behind me, the oscillating fan kept turning inside that fluorescent room, ready for the next order of business. Ahead of me, the Cul de Sac lights glowed softly, unchanged and unconcerned. But my home did not feel the same. It felt like it had been quietly placed on a ledger somewhere, with a growing column of figures ready to be filled in. That was when the stakes shifted from inconvenience to risk. The board had turned those 5 inches into a daily charge that could accumulate in the background like a slow leak. If I did nothing, the fines would build into real money, enough to justify liens and, eventually, the kind of legal action that makes a family wonder if they could actually lose their home over a piece of wood. The next week, the first fine statement arrived. It was a single sheet of paper, printed in grayscale, with our account number at the top and a new line item labeled "Fence Violation, Daily Fine." The amount due was still small, but the description carried an implied promise. This number would continue to grow as long as the board believed the fence was out of compliance. I pinned the statement next to the courtesy notice on the refrigerator, the two documents forming a kind of timeline. Each time I added a note to our grocery list, my eyes drifted over to that growing column of charges. It disturbed me how easily they could create debt with a simple vote and a few lines of text. The CCRs treated fines as a tool, but in practice they were more like a pressure system, slowly squeezing homeowners towards submission. My wife and I sat at the dining table that weekend, running numbers. We could, technically, afford the fines for a while. But it was not just the money. It was the principle of paying daily for something that felt fundamentally unfair. I had followed the process, gotten approval, and worked with a licensed contractor. The board was not correcting a rogue structure. They were asserting dominance over an inch count and using my compliance as proof that their authority meant more than context or reason. By that point, the situation had become painfully clear. The board had upheld the violation, started daily fines over a 5-inch overage caused by the slope of the land, and made it obvious that they were willing to lean on the threat of liens and legal action to force compliance. What had started as a simple privacy fence had turned into a slow-burn battle over control, money, and whether a homeowner had any real power inside a system designed to keep them in line. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to simply cave and cut the fence down, especially after watching Cheryl beam her quiet satisfaction each time she walked by. At the same time, I knew I could not ignore the fines forever. That was how people ended up as cautionary tales, the ones neighbors whispered about as the owners who lost their place after fighting the board. I needed a path that did not involve either total surrender or reckless defiance. I went back to the binder, this time reading not as a nervous rule follower but as someone searching for cracks in the walls. I studied sections I had glossed over before, provisions about temporary structures, decorative elements, holiday displays, and non-permanent installations. Somewhere in that dense stack of rules, I was sure there had to be something that the board leaned on when it suited them and ignored the rest of the time. That was when I noticed a small paragraph in CCR section 8.6, titled Seasonal and Temporary Structures. It allowed removable decorative elements, privacy screens, and trellises during certain times of year, provided they were not permanently affixed and did not pose a safety hazard. There was no explicit maximum height listed there, only language about stability and removal. It was meant for things like backyard arbors or seasonal privacy panels, but the wording was broad enough that my mind began to turn. If the association's big focus was on permanent fences, exceeding 6 feet as measured from the highest adjacent grade, what technically counted as permanent? Did something bolted into a post count more than something that slotted into place with removable brackets? Was the board enforcing an aesthetic, or were they enforcing the exact text of Section 7.4? The more I read, the more I saw inconsistency in how they defined those terms. I spent a few evenings in the backyard as the sun went down, tracing the top line of the fence with my eyes. The section they objected to was not long. It ran along the part of the yard where the slope from Cheryl's side was the most pronounced. If I trimmed that section down to under 6 feet from her side, the rest would be untouched. The basic privacy we wanted would remain. But that small slice of yard was exactly where I felt her presence most, the angle where her raised deck and sliding door lined up with our patio. The idea came slowly, more as a question than a revelation. What if that fence stayed within the 6-foot limit in every measurable way that mattered to Section 7.4, but the privacy we needed came from something on top of it that did not fit their narrow definition of a permanent fence? What if the top portion could be removed, lowered, or even relocated as needed, falling squarely into the category they themselves had described as removable decorative elements? Once the idea took root, it was hard to think about anything else. I started sketching designs at the kitchen table, the fine statement and courtesy notice still pinned on the refrigerator behind me like a reminder of what was at stake. I looked up hardware options that allowed for panels to be lifted off brackets without unscrewing anything, systems where weight and gravity did more of the work than bolts and nails. I was not planning anything unsafe or reckless. I just wanted to redefine what the fence actually was in the eyes of the CCRs. I called the contractor back, not to argue about what had been done, but to ask technical questions. I asked about ways to trim a small portion of the existing fence to bring it clearly under 6 feet on the higher side without compromising the structure. Then I asked about constructing a separate, removable topper that could slot into place above the trimmed section. It would not be bolted directly into the posts. Instead, it would rest in channels or brackets that could be lifted out whenever needed. He sounded puzzled at first, but as I explained the situation and the language in CCR section 8.6, he began to understand the angle. What I was proposing was, in essence, a two-piece system, a compliant 6-foot fence that met the association's strict reading of section 7.4, and a removable topper classified as a temporary privacy screen. Together they would give us the same sense of seclusion we had enjoyed, but technically the fence would no longer be the villain in the board's story. I spent one more night with the governing documents, double-checking the wording. Section 7.4 mentioned fences and permanent screening structures by name. Section 8.6 talked about removable decorative elements and privacy screens, using softer language and focusing on safety instead of exact measurements. It occurred to me that the board liked precise numbers when they were enforcing limits, but vague phrases when they were allowing something. That imbalance was going to be the hinge on which this whole HOA versus homeowner conflict turned. The fines continued to accrue during this planning stage, creeping up on each new statement. The amounts were still manageable, but the principal burned every time I saw them added to our account. I kept meticulous records, noting the dates, amounts, and descriptions. I treated each fine statement like a future exhibit in a case that had not yet been filed but might one day need to be. As I finalized the design for the removable topper, I realized I was no longer just trying to protect my own privacy. I was quietly preparing a move that would force the board to choose between clinging to their power or admitting they had pushed too far, and they would have to make that choice in front of the very neighbors they were trying to impress. The plan, as it stood then, was simple on paper but careful in practice. First, I would have the contractor lower the offending section of the fence to just under 6 feet as measured from Cheryl's side, leaving no room for argument. I would make sure this adjustment was documented with before and after photos, measurements, and a short note from the contractor confirming the final height. Then, once the permanent fence clearly met the strict terms of Section 7.4, I would introduce the removable topper. The topper would be built as a separate frame with vertical slats matching the rest of the fence's appearance. Instead of being bolted into the posts, it would slide into U-shaped metal channels screwed only into the inside face of the fence. The frame would rest in those channels by gravity alone. In practical terms, it would look seamless from our side, giving us the same continuous line of privacy. In technical terms, it would be a removable privacy screen, exactly the kind of structure Section 8.6 allowed. I decided I would not hide what I was doing, but I would not advertise it either. I would send the board a letter once the main fence was trimmed, attaching the contractor's note and photos. In that letter, I would state that the permanent fence now complied fully with Section 7.4 as measured from the highest adjacent grade. I would respectfully request that fines be halted and the violation removed from our account. I would not mention the topper yet. Because the real payoff, the satisfying revenge story angle of this whole HOA revenge story, was not in sneaking around them. It was in letting them declare themselves satisfied, only to discover later, in front of everyone, that their overreach had been neutralized by their own inconsistent rules. I did not know then exactly how the confrontation would play out, or how many more letters would come before it resolved. But as the contractor scheduled his return visit and I transferred the sketch of the removable topper into actual measurements, I felt something in me settle. I was no longer just reacting to the board's moves. I was making my own. The association had turned 5 inches into a weapon. I was about to turn their own bylaws into a shield. The contractor came back on a bright Saturday morning, the kind of day when the sunlight feels almost sharp against the fence boards. His truck rumbled to a stop at the curb, and a couple of neighbors glanced over from their driveways, pretending not to stare. I walked him along the side yard where the slope was most obvious, the section that had become the star of every letter, fine, an agenda line with my lot number attached to it. He measured from Cheryl's side this time, reading the numbers out loud, then shook his head at how small the difference actually was. 5 inches sounded bigger when written on formal letterhead than it looked on a tape measure. Still, we were not there to argue. We were there to erase that measurement as a weapon. He trimmed the section down with a careful series of cuts, bringing the highest point of the boards to just under 6 feet on the elevated side. From our yard, the difference was almost invisible. From Cheryl's sidewalk vantage point, the numbers no longer gave the board any leverage. I took photos from both sides, focusing on the tape measure pressed against the wood, the 6-foot mark clear and undeniable. After that, he installed the channels for the topper on the inside of the fence. We tested the frame, lifted it into place, set it into the channels, and then lifted it back out. No bolts. No permanent fasteners. Just weight, gravity, and a snug fit doing the work. In use, it would give us the same privacy line as before. Removed, it would reduce the structure to a perfectly compliant 6-foot fence. When he left, the yard felt different, not just because of the change in silhouette, but because I finally had a way to define my space on my own terms. The board could measure the fence all they wanted. They would find nothing to hold on to. The privacy they had tried to punish us for would now exist in a gray area of their own making. That afternoon, I drafted a letter to the association. I attached the contractor's note confirming the final fence height, along with clear photos showing the measurement from the highest adjacent grade. I referenced CCR Section 7.4 by number, stating plainly that the permanent fence now complied with its requirements. I requested that the violation be closed and the daily fines halted. I kept my tone calm. No threats. No commentary about fairness. Just facts and documentation. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was titled Final Compliance Notice, dated July 15, and it acknowledged that the fence on Lot 14 now conforms to CCR Section 7.4 as measured from the highest adjacent grade. It stated that daily fines would cease as of that date, and that the violation had been resolved. There was a line about the existing fine balance remaining on our account pending payment or further board action. I clipped that notice to the refrigerator beside the original courtesy notice and the fine statements, forming a neat, unpleasant little timeline. From the board's perspective, the story ended there. They had identified a violation, enforced it, and promptly closed it once we complied. From my perspective, the main act was just beginning. The first time I slid the removable topper into place, the evening breeze brushed across the yard with a soft rustle through the trees, and the shadows from the board stretched long across the patio. Standing inside my own space, I could no longer see Cheryl's deck or her glass door. The line of wood above eye level made the backyard feel whole again. It felt like reclaiming something that had quietly been taken. It did not take long for Cheryl to notice. Within a few days, I saw her on the sidewalk again, slowing at the side yard, staring up at the adjusted section. From the street, it still looked like a continuous wall of wood. But if you knew what to look for, you could see the faint seam where the topper frame met the cut fence line. She took a long look, then turned and walked away with a stiffness in her shoulders that said more than any words. 2 weeks after the final compliance notice, another envelope came, this one less formal, more like a generic form letter. It was a request for clarification, asking whether any additional modifications had been made to the fence and whether we had installed a secondary structure that might fall under the association's authority. It did not say where this request originated, but I could practically see Cheryl's handwriting behind the scenes. I answered with a short response. I confirmed that the permanent fence met the height restriction and referenced the association's own final compliance notice dated July 15. I added that we had installed a removable privacy screen consistent with CCR Section 8.6, which allows temporary and seasonal elements that are not permanently affixed. I offered to demonstrate its removability at the next open meeting. With that letter, I knew I was putting the board in a corner they had built themselves. If they pushed too hard against a removable screen that clearly fit their own temporary structure rule, they would not just look petty, they would risk stepping outside their own governing documents in a way that could be challenged, even formally, if I decided to take it further. When the next monthly meeting agenda went out to the neighborhood, a familiar line appeared near the bottom: homeowner discussion, Lot 14, fence clarification. It was not officially labeled as an enforcement hearing this time, but it was clear they wanted to address what I had done. I arrived early, my binder organized with tabs, CCR Section 7.4, CCR Section 8.6, the architectural change request, the courtesy notice dated May 29, the board agenda excerpt listing my lot under new business, the fine statements, and the final compliance notice. My evidence prop sat in order, silent but solid. Neighbors filtered in slowly, some pausing by the snack table, others taking chairs near the back. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting that same flat glow over everything. Cheryl slipped into a seat near the front, her posture straight, eyes fixed on the board. I took a spot where I could see their faces clearly. The board moved through routine topics first, as always. Budget updates. Landscaping complaints. A brief mention of pool rules. Then the president turned to the fence clarification item. He framed it as a discussion about maintaining consistent standards and understanding how homeowners might be interpreting rules on temporary elements. He looked in my direction, inviting me to speak. I stood and explained, calmly, that the permanent fence had been cut to meet the 6-foot limit as measured from the highest adjacent grade. I held up the contractor's note and the photo showing the tape measure pressed against the trimmed boards. Then I held up the final compliance notice, dated and signed, confirming that the board considered the matter resolved under Section 7.4. Next, I described the topper as a removable privacy screen, not bolted or nailed into the posts, resting instead in channels attached to the inside face. I cited CCR Section 8.6, reading from my printed copy where it allowed removable decorative elements, privacy screens, and trellises, as long as they were not permanent or unsafe. I emphasized that I had chosen this design specifically to align with that section. A few neighbors leaned forward, interested. I could see some of them thinking about their own backyards, their own half-remembered rules. The treasurer's expression tightened as I laid the documents out on the front table, one by one, forming a chain of events that made the board's escalation look less like neutral enforcement and more like a prolonged attempt to control something that no longer fit their definition of offense. To make things undeniable, I offered to demonstrate. The board hesitated, but with half the room now curious, they agreed to a quick walk out to my lot after the meeting's main business. It was not in their script, but refusing would have looked worse. When we stepped into my backyard after adjournment, the late evening sky was streaked with orange and purple, and the sound of sprinklers ticking in distant yards formed a soft backdrop. A small cluster of neighbors, along with the board and the property manager, gathered near the trimmed section. I stood inside the yard, reached up, and lifted the topper straight out of its channels. The frame came free in one smooth motion. I held it to the side so they could all see the clean, 6-foot line of the permanent fence beneath it. No bolts. No permanent fasteners above that line. Just a compliant fence and a removable screen, exactly as Section 8.6 allowed. The president's face did something subtle then, an almost imperceptible flicker between annoyance and reluctant respect. The treasurer glanced at the property manager, as if looking for backup. Cheryl, standing slightly apart, focused on the now exposed gap where the topper had been, her jaw tight. I set the topper back into place, letting it settle snugly into the channels again. From the outside, nothing looked different from before. From the inside, I knew the balance of power had shifted. After a moment of silence, the president thanked me for the demonstration and said they would take it under advisement. The words were vague, but the tone had changed. They knew what everyone had just witnessed, a homeowner who had followed their rules to the letter, even the ones they assumed no one would ever read closely. The formal resolution came a couple of weeks later, in the form of a letter that arrived on a quiet afternoon while a soft rain tapped against the front windows. Inside was a short statement from the board. They acknowledged that the fence on Lot 14 remained in compliance with CCR Section 7.4 and that the removable privacy screen did not constitute a separate permanent structure under the current language of CCR Section 8.6. They recorded the fence matter as closed and, in what they called a gesture of goodwill, voted to waive the outstanding fines that had accrued before the final compliance notice. They did not apologize. They did not admit fault. But the waiver of fines and the written acknowledgement that my topper was permissible under their own rules were more powerful than an apology would have been. It meant there was now a paper trail showing that the board had drawn a line and then been forced, by their own documents, to step back from overreaching. For me, the aftermath was quieter, almost anticlimactic in the best way. The binder moved from the dining table back to a shelf in the home office, thick with tabs and notes but no longer a daily presence at meals. The refrigerator was cleared of notices and statements, only the kids' drawings and a fresh grocery list remained. In the backyard, the fence and its removable topper stood like a physical reminder that boundaries cut both ways. They can box you in, but they can also protect you when you understand them well enough. Cheryl grew more distant after that evening demonstration. She still walked her dog past our house, but the long, inspecting pauses became shorter. She no longer lingered by the side yard. Over time, other small changes rippled through the cul de sac. Neighbors started asking more questions when they got letters. A few of them quietly asked me where specific sections were in the binder, and I noticed more people showing up at meetings with papers of their own. The board, for its part, announced a policy review on how they measured structural height in sloped yards. They framed it as an effort to create clearer guidelines for everyone, but I knew what had prompted it. They had learned that power wielded without care could backfire when someone took the time to read the fine print. On warm evenings, my family sat on the patio, the air carrying the scent of damp earth after sprinklers shut off, the fence shielding us from casual eyes. I could hear the faint hum of traffic beyond the subdivision, but within our yard there was a sense of calm we had not felt since the first notice appeared. We had paid for that calm, not just with contractor fees and temporarily accrued fines, but with time, attention, and a willingness to push back without breaking the system. The whole saga had started with 5 inches of wood and a neighbor who did not like losing sight lines. It ended with a board that had to admit, in writing, that homeowners had rights tucked between their covenants, and a street that now understood those rights a little better. The theme that ran through all of it was simple: unchecked authority will stretch until someone quietly, persistently pushes back. Tell me your most outrageous fence rule HOA horror in one line.